In a narrow interior space, the sound of a single discharge fails to travel beyond the next wall. The man holding the device pauses, not because of recoil, but to manually reset it. The spent cartridge does not eject on its own. The room remains otherwise unchanged. The weapon later known as the well rod did not begin as a pistol in the conventional sense. It began as a problem statement circulated inside the Special Operations Executive in late 1942. The document was not dramatic. It was typed, unsigned, and distributed through the Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. Its central question was simple: how to remove a single human obstacle at very close range in an urban or semi-urban environment without alerting anyone else within a few dozen yards. At that point in the war, SOE had already fielded suppressed versions of existing pistols. The Colt M1911 had been tested with detachable suppressors. The Browning High Power had been evaluated in similar fashion. These efforts produced predictable results. The suppressors reduced muzzle blast, but the mechanical noise of the slide cycling remained. The sound of brass hitting stone or wood was not negligible. More importantly, reliability dropped sharply. Slides short-stroked, springs required tuning, ammunition had to be carefully selected. None of this aligned with SOE's operational reality, where weapons were dropped by parachute, cached in damp cellars, and issued to agents with limited training time. By December 1942, the DMWD concluded that adapting a standard semi-automatic pistol was the wrong approach. A memorandum dated 14th of December, referenced DMWD OPS 442, states that automatic operation introduces unnecessary acoustic and mechanical complexity for a device intended for one or two deliberate discharges. The same memo recommends abandoning self-loading designs entirely. The responsibility for turning that recommendation into hardware fell to a small group of engineers and civilian specialists working under SOE's Station 99 at Welwyn. Among them was Major Hugh Reeves, an ordnance officer with experience in small arms testing rather than battlefield command. Reeves was not tasked with inventing a silent gun in the abstract. He was tasked with producing a tool that could reliably kill a man at arm's length, indoors, without alerting another man in the next room. The first design decision was mechanical simplicity. A manually operated bolt eliminated the sound of a cycling slide. It also eliminated the need for recoil energy to drive the action, which in turn allowed the use of heavy suppression without worrying about function. The bolt would be straight pull, rotating only enough to lock and unlock. There would be no extractor claw acting under spring tension during firing. The operator would fire, pause, and then manually retract the bolt to eject the spent case. The second decision concerned caliber. SOE had access to a wide range of ammunition, but standardization mattered. The 9x19mm Parabellum cartridge was rejected early. Its supersonic velocity would produce a ballistic crack regardless of suppression, unless heavily downloaded, which introduced reliability issues. The 45 ACP was also considered and rejected. While subsonic, its large diameter reduced the available volume for suppressor components around the barrel. It also increased recoil impulse, which was unnecessary for the intended role. The cartridge selected was the 9x19mm short, more commonly known as .380 ACP or 9mm Browning. In British service documentation, it was often referred to simply as 9mm as short. Standard military ball ammunition produced muzzle velocities in the range of 950 feet per second from a pistol-length barrel. With appropriate barrel venting, this could be reduced further below the speed of sound without altering the cartridge itself. The well rod's defining feature was its suppressor, which was not an accessory but the primary structure of the weapon. The barrel was short, approximately 3 inches in effective rifled length, and perforated with a series of radial ports. These ports allowed propellant gases to bleed off into an expansion chamber immediately upon bullet travel. The suppressor body surrounded the barrel concentrically and extended forward several inches beyond the muzzle. Inside this cylindrical body were a series of rubber baffles. These were not metal wipes in the modern sense. They were thick rubber discs with a central aperture slightly smaller than bullet diameter. When a bullet passed through, it physically displaced and cut the rubber, sealing behind it momentarily and trapping gas. This produced extremely effective initial sound reduction. It also meant that the suppressor had a finite lifespan. A DMWD test report dated 3rd of March 1943 records the results of controlled firings at a distance of 10 feet from the muzzle. On the first discharge, The measured sound pressure level was described as comparable to the mechanical action of a typewriter. On the 5th discharge, the report notes a discernible increase in report. By the 10th discharge, the suppressor was considered operationally compromised. This was not a flaw, it was an accepted parameter. SOE doctrine did not envision agents firing 10 rounds in succession. The bolt itself was machined from steel and operated by a knurled knob at the rear. Locking was achieved by rotating the bolt handle into a recess, similar in concept to a rifle but scaled down. The firing pin was integral to the bolt assembly. There was no separate hammer. The trigger directly released the firing pin under spring tension. This reduced the number of moving parts and eliminated additional noise sources. One of the most unconventional aspects of the design was the grip. Instead of conventional grip panels, the well rod used a hollow steel tube covered in rubber. This tube doubled as the magazine housing. The magazine was single stack, holding 6 rounds of .380 ACP. The rubber covering provided a degree of insulation against cold and improved purchase, but it also served a secondary purpose. In extremis, the weapon could be fired without a magazine inserted, using it as a single-shot device. The grip tube was long enough to be braced against the operator's forearm or thigh. Early prototypes lacked any form of safety. This was quickly identified as unacceptable, even by SOE standards. A simple cross-bolt safety was added above the trigger. It blocked trigger movement rather than the firing pin. This choice reflected manufacturing expediency rather than ideal design, but it proved adequate. Testing proceeded in stages. The first test series, conducted in January 1943, focused on sound reduction alone. Weapons were fired inside enclosed rooms with observers stationed in adjacent spaces. Notes from these tests are dry and repetitive. Observer in corridor reports no audible discharge. Observer 1 room removed reports faint thud. There is no embellishment. The second test series examined terminal effectiveness. Ballistic gelatin was used initially, followed by animal carcasses. Penetration at close range was sufficient. The .380 round, while modest by military standards, was lethal at the distances intended. A report dated 22nd of February 1943 states that cranial penetration is reliable at contact and near contact distances. The third test series addressed durability. Rubber baffles were subjected to repeated firings, temperature variation, and prolonged storage. They hardened over time. They cracked in cold conditions. None of this surprised the designers. Replacement baffle stacks were issued with the weapon. Agents were instructed, in plain language, that the suppressor was consumable. By mid-1943, the design was standardized as the Welrod WWII. The name itself was a contraction of Welwyn and Rod, the latter reflecting the weapon's cylindrical profile. It was never intended to be a public designation. In official correspondence, it was often referred to simply as the silent pistol. Manufacture was carried out in small batches. Tolerances were not refined to peacetime standards, but they did not need to be. The bolt and barrel were the critical components. The suppressor tube could be produced with relatively simple tooling. Rubber baffles were cut from sheet material using dies. Assembly was straightforward. This allowed production to be dispersed and concealed. Operational use followed. Well rods were issued to SOE agents operating in occupied Europe. They were also supplied to resistance groups under strict conditions. Training emphasized restraint. The weapon was not for combat. It was for a single task, performed quickly, at close range, and then discarded or hidden. Feedback from the field was limited, by design. Agents who used the weapon successfully did not write after-action reports describing the experience in detail. What documentation exists is indirect. A post-war SOE summary notes that the device fulfilled its intended purpose when employed within its design parameters. The Mech 2 variant introduced minor changes. The most significant was a simplified safety mechanism and slight alterations to the suppressor internals to ease manufacture. Performance remained broadly the same. There was no attempt to extend suppressor life. That was not the requirement. In evaluating the Welrod, it is tempting to focus on its reputation. That reputation, however, was constructed later. At the time of its development and use, it was simply another tool. It was not issued widely, it was not celebrated, it solved a narrow problem. The engineering reflects that narrowness. Every design choice trades longevity, versatility, and comfort for predictability and silence over a handful of shots. the rubber baffles that degrade after use, the bolt that must be manually cycled, the small magazine capacity. None of these are oversights. They are evidence of a weapon designed without illusion. It does not pretend to be more than it is. It was built to function once or twice under controlled conditions, and then to cease to matter. That is why it looks the way it does. That is why it operates the way it does. And that is why, despite its later notoriety, it remained largely unknown outside the small circle of people who were meant to use it.